Hello everybody. Today we're going to talk about a 1988 Honda Prelude Si. It's got the 2.0 liter double overhead cam 4-cylinder with a 5-speed manual transmission. The problem that the car was having, I know it's an old car. We use it to drive around town. We could get rid of it. It's just, it's a nice little old car. Hate to just throw it away. But the problem that we're having with it is the alternator was not charging properly. Now, many years ago, I've replaced the alternator on it when the alternator really went bad. I think I've done it probably twice. And, no problem. You change the alternator, it charges. But what was happening is the alternator would charge when you first start the vehicle. And then sometimes as you're driving it, or even while it's idling before you drive off in the car, it would start not charging, and it would not charge properly unless you shut it off sometimes and start it back up. It may charge for a little while and then just randomly stop charging. So it made the vehicle undrivable, because you could be out going down the road and then all of a sudden it wouldn't charge. One thing that I did notice is if you turn the blower motor on and the lights while it was charging, then all of a sudden the alternator would try to really put some output, and it would, there'd be a load on the alternator. All of a sudden it would stop charging. And it was dangerous because you could be driving somewhere and the car would, the battery would go dead. The ignition system, the fuel injection would not run properly. Cars start sputtering. There's one time where I was riding around locally and barely made it home. So anyway, the first thing that I did, of course, was I replaced the alternator. And I actually had the alternator tested on a machine. It tested good. But I went ahead and replaced the alternator anyway, because I was thinking maybe it's testing properly here on the test bench on the machine, and then in its real environment with the vibrations of the engine compartment, maybe the heat of the engine, maybe that's affecting it, maybe the voltage regulator inside, or the brushes weren't in the same environment as on the test bench. Anyway, I went ahead and replaced the alternator. Same exact thing, wasn't charging properly. It would charge sometimes. Again, driving down the road, you could sometimes have it idling and all of a sudden it wouldn't charge. I know other people probably ran into this and never figured out the solution, but I promise you I'm going to tell you the solution here in a little bit. The next step was I checked all the wiring, grounds, the plug in the back of the alternator, the harness, even all the way up to the fuse box. Checked everything. Checked voltages out of the main wires and the green plug that plugs into the back of the alternator. Documented all those in the different modes, from first starting it to when it's charging, when it's not charging. Could not figure out this problem. The one thing I did figure out was something from the computer was telling the alternator not to charge. So what was my next step? Number 3, I swapped the ECU. I purchased another ECU, not the exact same model, it was close. Put the new ECU in the car, same exact thing. I was pretty stumped at this point. I'm pretty good at figuring out electrical problems on vehicles. I've done it my whole life. This one was a, it was a very difficult thing. So after swapping the ECU, didn't fix the problem. Thought maybe it was a fuse in the main fuse box or a problem in the main fuse box. Traced wires all the way over there. I bought an extra fuse box off of eBay. Used it to trace out circuits in the factory fuse box. As a matter of fact, I started replacing some fuses thinking maybe some of the connectors were corroded, but they weren't. That led me nowhere. Next thing I did was took apart the ignition switch out of the column and the wiring harness that runs over under the part of the dash. I did replace that ignition switch many years ago. It really went bad probably 10, 12 years ago. And I remember the replacement, the harness wasn't quite long enough. Wasn't like the factory one. So I was thinking maybe that tension on that wiring harness was causing a problem. So I took everything apart and examined it. Looked good, it was fine. I even swapped out, I didn't put it in this list, but I swapped out the main, what do you call it, the main circuit, the main relay under the dash. And I checked all the wiring on it just for the heck of it. No go, it didn't fix the problem. The one thing I did notice during all this is when you start the vehicle up, sometimes the belt would squeak. And this has happened before in the past, like when it's damp outside. And I've tightened the belts. You know, anybody that's worked on an 88 Prelude or some of those Hondas realize the tensioner systems are very complicated. Difficult to look at. There's like a bolt that you typically turn to put tension, and then you have another bolt or nut to tighten up to tighten the pulley. It's like that on the alternator belt and also on the I believe it's the power steering. Yeah, power steering. And so they're kind of hard to reach, but I tried tightening the belts up, and I eventually replaced the belts. And those old 2.0 Preludes, they leak oil. You know, I've replaced the front crank seal on it before. Valve cover gasket's common to seep. I've replaced it. But there's always oil around that part of the engine, and it's not good for the belts or whatever. But so anyway, I replaced the belts, and still same problem with the alternator. You know, even though I'd hear a squeak every once in a while. And I ended up, next step, number 7, I replaced the power steering pump. And the reason why I did that, I replaced it years ago. The pump started getting to where it was whining or whatever. So I had an extra pump. I went ahead and replaced it again. And it seemed to help with some of the belt squeaking that would occur every once in a while. The belt will squall. Anybody knows in those old Hondas Prelude, if you drive through a puddle of water, if it's damp outside, the belt would squeak, you know, because the water splashes up on the belt. And then as it dries in a few seconds, you know, the belt would squeak. But anyway, this didn't solve the problem. The power steering pump that I put on there made it a little bit easier to steer, but still no go on the alternator problem. Finally, on number 8, and here's the solution to the problem. I realized that, hey, every once in a while this belt's squeaking. Replacing the belts, tensioning the belts, replacing the power steering pump. Why is this thing squeaking? Well, I looked down and I realized, is this harmonic balancer crank pulley, has it gone bad? Because the alternator belt runs around the big pulley. When I say big pulley, the harmonic balancer pulley, the crank pulley, has 2 belt grooves in it. One of them's for the alternator and the air conditioning compressor. It's the large one. And the smaller pulley on the front, which is made as a single piece to the main harmonic balancer, it drives the power steering pump. So here's what I did. I took some paint and I drew a line across the large crank pulley that runs the alternator onto the main body of the harmonic balancer pulley, or the main harmonic balancer, which runs directly off the crankshaft. Between that is an elastomer rubber vibration seal. You know, so the big pulley for the alternator is not one unit on the harmonic balancer itself. It's separated by a rubber dampener. Funny thing is, I replaced that whole harmonic balancer pulley, crank pulley, probably 10 or 12 years prior, so it's not the factory one. I did replace it many years ago. but when I put the white paint across it and I started the car up, I revved it, got it to squeak, the belt to squeak, shut it off. Of course the alternator wasn't charging properly. Crawl up under the car and look at it. The white line that I drew with the paint did not line up. So the part on the paint that was on the large crank pulley that drives the alternator had moved about 180 degrees out from where it should be. So that told me that the alternator part of the pulley, the ring, was no longer bonded to the inner part of the harmonic balancer, and that was the problem all along. So what's happening is the computer was detecting an RPM difference between the alternator and the crankshaft, and it would automatically not allow the alternator to charge. It would send the signal from the computer to the alternator, hey, don't charge. And that was the problem. So I'm going to show you a little bit of a video showing what I did to fix the issue, because the crank pulley for the 88 through, I believe, about a 90 or 91 model Prelude, so it fits those years, 88, 89, 90, maybe 91, is no longer available. So you can't source that thing new anymore like I did 10 or 12 years ago. You have to probably fix the existing one that you have. I'm going to show you what I did. Okay, this is a 1988 Honda Prelude. I replaced this lower pulley balancer years ago. It's no longer available. Bottom ring, which is the large pulley that drives from the alternator, it's come unbonded from the pulley itself. That's why the alternator wasn't charging. The computer was detecting basically an RPM difference from the crankshaft to the alternator, and it would not allow the alternator to charge because the pulley was slipping. What I'm going to do, I'm going to re-glue the large pulley to the actual harmonic balancer body itself. There is a drilled out spot right here, which is where they balance it. I have no idea where this thing lines up, so I'm going to guess. I'm just going to hope it's basically neutral balance. Maybe the ring itself was a little bit off, which is the reason why they drilled it. Possibly not. Heck, don't have any choice. That's what I'm going to do. I'm either going to take some, believe it or not, Shoe Goo. This stuff actually is very pliable and it bonds like hell. If it's not too thick, I should be able to slide this back up on the rubber portion itself on the harmonic balancer, this main pulley for the alternator and the ring. If not, I'm going to clean it back off and I'm going to try some Flex Seal. It's much thinner. I'd feel better with the Shoe Goo because it's thicker and it'll actually dampen harmonics, and it's very pliable, like I said. I've cleaned it with carburetor spray inside here. I've cleaned the rubber insulator right here, and hopefully I can put some Shoe Goo on it, slide that thing up on there, line it up. I want to push it back, make sure that there's a slight lip right here on the back of this elastomer, this rubber, so I shouldn't be able to go back too far with it. But if I don't get this bonded, the car is junk anyway, because you can't find the pulley anywhere. So I've had it off before years ago. Replaced, this is actually a new one. I'd say probably 10 or 12 years ago. It's not the factory one, but again, it's not available. So let me see what I can do. Show you right quick how some of that Shoe Goo is kind of, if you can can see that, but it's kind of squirting out around the pulley there, right in there too. But one thing I am worried about is the temperature resilience of the Shoe Goo. It probably isn't made for engine temps, but we'll see how it goes. Okay, I was able to put some Shoe Goo on there. What I did was I originally put it on the outside ring and then tried to slide the ring up there, but all it did was squirt the Shoe Goo out. And it's because the rubber that's on the harmonic balancer portion of the pulley has a groove in it, kind of a low spot. So what I did was I put the Shoe Goo all the way around the low spot on the rubber, filled it up pretty good, and then I slid the ring on top of it and I rotated it around to get it to spread out as I pushed it back to let it seat. So I've got it on there now. I'm just going to let it dry and check it maybe tomorrow and see if that bonded it back. Maybe it's enough. The main load is the alternator. It does drive from the air compressor to the air conditioning compressor, but the air conditioning compressor on this thing doesn't work anymore. I replaced it years ago and it was still bad, but anyway, we'll see how it goes. I'm going to give you an update. I went ahead and put everything back together and I washed it. I just want to let you know the Shoe Goo worked great. This thing charges instantly because the computer now calculates that the alternator and crankshaft are moving in the correct RPM. So if you have a 88 or I think 90 or 91 Prelude and you can't find a harmonic balancer pulley because the big ring is slipped off the main part of the harmonic balancer, just glue the thing back on with some Shoe Goo. The Shoe Goo worked very well. I don't know about temperature, we'll just have to see, but it doesn't slip at all. It held very good. I tested it with my hands, went ahead, assembled everything, and it's doing great. Hope that helps somebody.